To understand this story, you need to understand where it happened. Grosse Pointe is not one place. It's a collection of 5 small communities clustered along the Lake St. Clair shoreline just east of Detroit. Grosse Pointe Park, Grosse Pointe Woods, Grosse Pointe City, Grosse Pointe Shores, Grosse Pointe Farms. Each one distinct, but all sharing the same quality: old money manicured lawns, country clubs, church socials, block parties, the kind of place where people know each other's families, where belonging matters, where reputation is currency. Drive west out of Grosse Pointe Park, and within a couple of miles you are in one of the most economically distressed urban areas in the United States. The contrast is striking and sudden. The border between the two worlds is not gradual. It's a street corner. That contrast matters to this story. Because on the morning of January 25, 2012, a tow truck driver patrolling the alleys of Detroit's east side spotted a black Mercedes SUV parked in an alley that had no business being there. He called it in. When police arrived and found the vehicle intact, airbags still in place, tires still on the rims, nothing stripped, they knew immediately this wasn't an abandoned, stolen car. In the back seat, arranged awkwardly with her knees on the floorboard, was the body of 56-year-old Jane Bashara. She was still dressed in work clothes. Her jacket was on backwards, pulled over her but not properly on her, as though it had been placed there after the fact. Her house slippers were under her body, clean, no debris, no dirt. While her feet showed traces of vegetation, the car key was on the driver's side floor, her purse had been emptied onto the passenger seat. Her phone, her checkbook, her medication, scattered but all still there. Nothing had been stolen. Jane had not been robbed. The medical examiner would confirm what officers suspected within hours. Jane Bashara had been strangled. Her windpipe had been crushed. She had fought. There was bruising on her face. Her fingernails were broken. She had not been killed in that alley. Jane Elizabeth Bashara was a woman who had built everything herself. She grew up in Mount Clemens, Michigan, earned a bachelor's degree, and then a master's in business administration, one from Central Michigan University, one from the University of Detroit Mercy. She worked for Detroit Edison for 25 years, rising to a senior level before eventually leaving to help manage her husband's business interests. By 2012, she had returned to the workforce with a new company, a marketing and energy consulting firm where colleagues described her as sharp, dependable, and highly professional. Outside work, Jane was deeply embedded in the Grosse Pointe community. She had served as president of the Grosse Pointe South High School Mothers Club. She volunteered at school events. She was the kind of person who showed up for her children, for her neighborhood, for the people around her. She and her husband Bob had married on October 26, 1985. They had a son, Robert, and a daughter, Jessica. They owned a home on Middlesex Road in Grosse Pointe Park, a street so well known for its sociable, community-minded residents that Bob himself had earned the neighborhood nickname, the Mayor of Middlesex, a title he wore with considerable satisfaction. To most people looking from the outside, the Basharas were a Grosse Pointe success story. Robert Bashara, Bob, was the son of George Bashara, a Michigan appellate court judge and member of the Board of Governors at Wayne State University. He had grown up with the weight and benefit of a prominent family name in a prominent community, and he had largely leveraged it. He owned commercial properties in the area, including a building that housed a bar called the Hard Luck Lounge and another establishment called Dillon's. He was a member of Lakeshore Country Club, was involved in Rotary, and made himself visible in exactly the ways that mattered in a community like Grosse Pointe. He was also, by the late 1990s, living a life that was almost entirely hidden from the community he had cultivated so carefully. The Bashara marriage had become a formality. Their physical relationship had ended. Bob suffered from health issues that compounded the distance between them. He began spending time online, gambling at first, and then, through an advertisement that appeared while he was gambling one evening, discovering the world of alt.com, a website dedicated to connecting people interested in dominance and submission relationships. Bob was immediately drawn in. What he found was a community of people who operated with a clear structure: a dominant partner, the master, and a submissive partner, the slave. He believed he had the temperament and personality to be exactly the kind of dominant figure this world rewarded. He began attending events, he began meeting people, and he began spending significant amounts of time and energy building a second life that ran entirely parallel to his public one in Grosse Pointe. Jane knew her husband was involved in something she wanted no part of. She told a friend that Bob was getting into some unusual sexual territory and that he could do whatever he wanted. She wasn't interested. The marriage continued in form. In practice, they had become, as Bob himself would later describe it to a police officer, two ships passing in the night. In 2005, Bob met a woman named Venetia Porter through the alt.com community. She was in her 40s, married with a husband who was also engaged in the lifestyle and who allowed her to explore relationships independently. Bob and Venetia became close. He took her to the country club, to church, to Jessica's volleyball games. He introduced her carefully to the edges of his family and social world, presenting her as a friend, never explaining the nature of the relationship to anyone who didn't already know. He also decided he needed a dedicated space. In the basement of the Hard Luck Lounge, his own commercial property, he created a private room. Hooks were installed in the ceiling. Rope rigging was set up along the walls. It was a space designed entirely for the activities he and Venetia engaged in, accessible through the bar's basement, without the patrons above ever having any idea it existed. In 2006, with the family's finances becoming increasingly complicated, Bob had taken money from Jane's retirement account without her knowledge. Their credit was in poor shape, and they had borrowed from Bob's mother, Nancy. Jane left her long career at Detroit Edison to take over the bookkeeping for Bob's businesses. It was meant to help stabilize things. Instead, it gave Jane a direct view of the financial disorder her husband had created and the discovery of what he had taken from her. Despite all of this, when Bob raised the subject of divorce after Jessica started university, Jane wasn't ready. She proposed counseling. They went. She even arranged a trip that she told Jessica later had, at least temporarily, helped them. It didn't last. In August 2008, Bob made a new connection through alt.com. Her name was Rachel Gillett. She was single in her 30s and looking to explore a submissive relationship. Bob's profile told her he was a widower raising a daughter alone. He did not mention the son. He did not mention the wife. Rachel and Bob began meeting regularly. He took her around Grosse Pointe, introduced her gradually to elements of his life. In the ceremony that marks the formalization of a dominant and submissive relationship in this community, called collaring, comparable in its symbolism to an engagement, he gave Rachel a collar. He also gave her a diamond ring that had been intended as a family heirloom for his daughter. Rachel wore it on her right hand. She told him she wouldn't move it to her left until he was actually free. When Rachel found a piece of mail in Bob's car addressed to a woman named Jane, she searched online. She found Jane Bashara, well documented through years of community involvement and school board work. She confronted Bob. He admitted they were technically still married, but told her they were separated, that a divorce was imminent, that the only reason he had hidden it was because he thought the truth would push Rachel away. She took him back. He continued to lie. The promised divorce date shifted repeatedly. When Jessica finished high school, when Jessica started university, when the timing was right. Each deadline came and went. The house on Middlesex still had Bob in it. The divorce papers Rachel asked to see were always lost, always being obtained, always coming next week. In October 2011, Bob and Rachel began house hunting. They found a property in Grosse Pointe Park, about 13 blocks from the Middlesex home. They planned to close on January 27, 2012. But closing required documentation of Bob's marital status. Under Michigan law, a spouse has property rights that must be declared at the time of purchase. Bob's attorney needed proof of divorce. There was no proof of divorce. Bob Bashara was still married to Jane. On January 20th, 4 days before Jane died, Rachel gave Bob a deadline: show her the divorce paperwork, or they were finished. Joe Gentz was 50 years old, a large man, well over 6 feet, heavy-set, who had suffered a stroke at birth that left him with a significantly lower than average IQ. He lived with compounding mental health challenges, including bipolar disorder and intermittent explosive disorder, a condition that caused him to react with sudden and severe anger to minor provocations. He had been in and out of hospitalization over the years. He was trying to stabilize his life sufficiently to regain custody of his daughter. A furniture dealer named Steve Tibido, who had business dealings with Bob Bashara through Bob's apartment complex, asked Bob if he could give Joe some handyman work. Bob said yes. Joe began doing odd jobs at Bob's properties. Their contact was regular and practical. That autumn, several months before Jane's death, Joe began telling people about a conversation he'd had with his employer. He didn't always use Bob's last name. He referred to him as his friend Bob, his boss Bob. But the substance of what he described to multiple people was consistent. Bob had asked him to kill Bob's wife and had offered him $5,000 and an old Cadillac in exchange. Bob, Joe said, was on a deadline. Joe's friends responded in various ways. One told him to go to the police and offered to take him. He declined. Another told him the person making the offer probably wasn't serious. Joe said, "They're serious." Nobody called the police. Jane Bashara's last day began normally. She left for work early, as she always did. Her colleagues at the energy consulting firm saw her through the day. She left the office around 4:10 in the afternoon. On the drive home, she called her daughter, Jessica, and the two made plans to speak again that evening about a summer job Jane was helping her secure. Cell phone records showed her BlackBerry arriving at the Middlesex address at approximately 4:33 p.m. Bob was home. At around 6 p.m., Joe Gentz arrived at the Bashara house. He came to the attached garage where Bob met him. According to Joe's later account, Bob was agitated, pressing him on the timeline, reminding him of what was at stake. While the two men were in the garage, Jane came out to investigate the noise. She was frustrated about the clutter Bob kept in the space. Equipment, boxes, old belongings that had accumulated over years. What happened in the next few minutes happened quickly. Bob told Joe to act. When Joe hesitated, Bob produced a handgun and made clear that Joe's options had narrowed to one. Joe struck Jane from behind, knocking her down. She called for Bob as she struggled. Bob told Joe to finish it. Jane fought. The struggle lasted several minutes. When it was over, Bob told Joe to put her in the car. Joe carried Jane's body to the Mercedes. Bob placed her jacket over her, putting it on backwards in his haste. He emptied her purse onto the passenger seat floor. Her BlackBerry ended up among the scattered contents. Joe drove the Mercedes east into Detroit and left it in an alley near 7 Mile Road and Gratiot Avenue, a neighborhood of abandoned houses and vacant lots where an out-of-place luxury vehicle would be unremarkable until morning. Joe walked to a nearby McDonald's. A security camera captured him there at 7:47 p.m. He bought food, used the restroom, took a bus toward the Grosse Pointe border, stopped at a liquor store, and then spent the evening at a bar a block from his apartment. He was there from 9 p.m. until midnight. Bob drove to the Hard Luck Lounge. He swept the alley behind the building, and something a tenant who had lived above the bar for 3 years said she had never seen him do before. At around 6:45, he went inside, sat in a booth, ordered a drink, and told the bartender he was waiting for a friend. A friend arrived around 7:30. The two sat together until 8 p.m. Bob drove home. At 8 p.m., he walked into a house where the television was on, and Jane's work bag was in the mudroom, and began calling her friends to ask if they'd heard from her. The sequence of calls Bob made that night was later examined in detail by investigators. He texted Jane's close friend Deborah at 8:15, asking if she'd heard from Jane. He called Rachel, who knew nothing of what had happened, to tell her Jane was missing. He called Jane's cell phone twice at 8:41. The phone, according to tower records, was in northeast Detroit, in the alley where the Mercedes had been left. There was no answer. Deborah called him back at 9:15. She thought the level of alarm was unusual. Jane hadn't been gone long, and Bob wasn't someone who typically called Deborah to ask about Jane's whereabouts in the 20 years she had known the family. She and another close friend, Roxanne, drove to the Bashara house. When they arrived, Bob took them through every room in the house, flipping lights on, stating the obvious that Jane wasn't there. Roxanne noted later that Bob led them through every room but did not take them to the attached garage. At 10:08 p.m., Bob called his mother Nancy and asked her to come over. He also asked her to stop at St. John's Hospital on her way. He mentioned there might be a Jane Doe there. At 11:01 p.m., police records showed the first call to St. John's was made from the Bashara house, nearly an hour after he had asked his mother to check there in person. Bob made his first call to Grosse Pointe Park police at 10:36. He told them Jane had been missing almost 3 hours. He declined at that point to have her information entered into the regional law enforcement network. An officer was eventually dispatched at 11:38. When the officer searched the property, he found nothing out of the ordinary in the garage. He noted boxes and plastic wrap on the floor, but no sign of struggle. He also noted that valuables throughout the house were undisturbed. After the officer left, Bob continued calling. He called police again at 1:37 a.m. to ask about Jane's phone. He called again at 4:47 a.m. to provide her social security number. He called Verizon to ask about GPS tracking. He called Jane's employer at 7:26 a.m. At 7 a.m. on January 25th, a tow truck driver found the Mercedes in a Detroit alley. On January 27th, Grosse Pointe Park Police Chief David Hiller announced that Bob Bashara was a person of interest in the investigation. He said there were no other persons of interest at that time. Bob appeared on local news. He gave interviews. He said he had nothing to do with Jane's death and wanted the person responsible found and punished. His children appeared beside him. Jessica had gone on Good Morning America with her father. Rachel, watching one of Bob's televised interviews, heard him refer to Jane as his wife. After days of near silence from Bob following the murder, this was her confirmation of something she had already suspected. He had been lying about everything from the beginning. She went to the police. She told them about the relationship, the promises, the collaring, the house they had been about to purchase. She ended contact with Bob entirely, and when he continued to reach out, eventually obtained a personal protection order against him. Police traced Joe Gents through his phone records. His contact with Bob, in the days immediately before and after the murder, was visible and extensive. When detectives brought him in for questioning on January 30th, he initially denied knowing Bob well. Then they showed him his own phone records. He left the interview abruptly, citing a custody hearing. That evening, Joe went to a friend's house in a state of acute distress. He said he was afraid Bob would come after him. He said he had made a terrible mistake. A pastor who happened to be present spoke with him. Joe showered, shaved, put on a suit, and at 2 a.m. walked into the Grosse Pointe Park police station and turned himself in. He asked to be placed in protective custody. He told them what had happened in the garage. Police recovered a duffel bag of clothing Joe had discarded at a gas station the night of the murder. Joe Gentz was charged with first-degree murder on March 5, 2012. In the months following Jane's murder, Bob became increasingly focused on what Joe might say in court. He began calling Steve Tibito, the furniture dealer who had originally connected him with Joe, with growing frequency. He told Tibito that Joe was going to destroy him. He talked about needing to deal with the situation. He said he couldn't go away for this. Tibito contacted detectives. He agreed to cooperate. He allowed a recording device to be placed on his phone and later agreed to wear a wire during in-person meetings. In the first recorded meeting at Bob's apartment complex where Tibito was delivering a refrigerator, Bob began talking about Joe. He said Joe was going to throw him under the bus. He said, if he can't get to Joe, it's his life. Then he leaned forward and felt Tibito's jacket for a wire. Tibito said it was against his religion to wear one. Bob accepted this and asked who was on Tibito's hip. The shape of a handgun was visible. He then whispered in Tibito's ear, did he know anyone who could take care of Joe? At a second meeting at Tibito's store, Bob again checked for a wire, patting Tibito down while a recording device sat in Tibito's shirt pocket. He again asked whether Joe could be reached inside prison. Tibito said it could be arranged. He outlined options. Bob said he needed it done within 3 weeks before Joe's competency hearing in July. On June 25, 2012, Bob returned to the furniture store and laid out $2,000 in cash on the counter. That same day, he was arrested. Bob Bashara was arrested and charged with solicitation to commit murder. He had over $1,000 in additional cash on him at the time of arrest. He was reportedly placed on suicide watch and broke down after his arrest. Bail was set at $15 million. His children, who had stood beside him publicly since the beginning, began to step back. While awaiting trial, Bob was placed in a cell at the Wayne County Jail with a man named Larry Allington. The two spent long hours together and talked extensively. Larry later told investigators that Bob had spoken about Jane's death, about the lifestyle, and about his ongoing desperation to silence Joe Gentz. One afternoon, while the two were playing cards, Larry said to Bob directly, "You had your wife killed." Bob replied that he hadn't killed her. Larry pressed further, "You paid Joe Gentz to kill her." Bob, according to Larry, replied that this was exactly why he needed Joe dealt with. Bob also told Larry he now wanted Steve Tibito, the man who had cooperated with police, eliminated as well. He asked Larry if, through connections Larry had in the prison system, he could arrange for both men to be reached. Larry said it was possible, for a price of $5,000 to $10,000 per target. Bob said he could mortgage a property to raise the funds. He wrote the property address on a scrap of paper and gave it to Larry. He offered to put $50 per month into Larry's commissary account as a down payment. Larry wrote a letter to the Wayne County prosecutor and gave investigators the handwritten note from Bob. He was told he would not receive any leniency in his own sentence in exchange for the information. He provided it anyway. Bob Bashara's murder trial opened in the summer of 2014. Assistant Wayne County prosecutor Lisa Lindsay described Bob as the puppet master who had set the entire killing in motion from behind the scenes. Nearly 500 pieces of evidence were presented. More than 70 witnesses testified over a 10-week period. The defense argued that Joe Gentz, a man with significant cognitive limitations who had already changed elements of his account, was an unreliable witness, and that the prosecution had failed to establish Bob's direct involvement in the killing. They suggested Jane could have been the victim of a random violent crime unconnected to her husband. The prosecution countered with the timeline, the phone records, the wire recordings, the cellmate's testimony, the financial motive, the fact that divorcing Jane would have cost Bob significantly in a state where marital property rights are substantial, and the pattern of behavior that ran from the first conversation with Joe months before the murder through the multiple subsequent attempts to have witnesses killed. Joe Gents did not testify at trial, but the evidence his cooperation had generated was extensive. A witness named Paul Monroe testified that Bob had told him, before Jane's death, that he had paid someone to kill his wife because divorcing her would be like losing money. Two other witnesses said Bob had told them, in December 2011, the month before the murder, that it would be the last Christmas Jane would spend in the house. Bob Bashara was found guilty on all 6 felony counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit murder, perjury, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. He showed no visible emotion when the verdict was read. On December 18, 2014, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, plus additional concurrent and consecutive terms on the other counts. Bob Bashara appealed his conviction, arguing that his defense had been ineffective and that he had been denied a fair trial. The Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the conviction in September 2017, describing the case as straightforward and finding that he had received a vigorous defense. He appealed again to the Michigan Supreme Court, which denied his application without detailed comment. Bob Bashara died on August 17, 2020, at the Woodland Center Correctional Facility in Whitmore Lake, Michigan. He was 62 years old. He had served 8 years of his life sentence. Jane's sister, Julie Rowe, released a statement when he died. She said, "I am disappointed. He only spent 8 years in prison. That is just not long enough for all that he ruined." Joe Gents pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in December 2012 and was sentenced to 17 to 28 years. He had agreed, as part of his plea, to testify in any future proceedings if called upon to do so. She was 56 years old. She had built a career, raised 2 children, stayed active in her community through years of a marriage that had quietly become something else entirely. She kept going. She tried counseling. She planned a trip that she told her daughter had helped save something between her and Bob. She went back to work when the finances demanded it. She kept showing up. She left for work on the morning of January 24th and called her daughter on the way home to make plans for later that evening. She never made that second call. The case was later featured in a Dateline NBC special that drew on interviews with investigators, witnesses, and journalists who had covered the story from the beginning. The book that formed the basis of the podcast episode, Master Betrayal: The Conspiracy to Kill Jane Bashara by Andrew Moreland, remains one of the most detailed accounts of the case. Jane Bashara deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved, at minimum, to be remembered as who she was, rather than only as what was done to her. She was a mother. She was a professional. She was the kind of person who showed up for the people around her. Her husband called her a ship passing in the night. She was considerably more than that.